last week I entitled the lesson Jehovah Jireh. And there are 7, by the way, I haven't taught this lesson forever. There are 7 Hebrew names who define God, and Jehovah Jireh is one of them. Each of them starts with Jehovah. There's Jehovah Jireh, there's Jehovah Shalom, there's Jehovah Nissi, that's the Lord my banner. Jehovah Shalom would be the Lord my peace. There's, what are some of the others? There's 7 of them. Jehovah Jireh, there's a gospel chorus we used to sing around here. I haven't heard Angie do it in quite a while. Jehovah Jireh, my provider. His grace is sufficient for me. Jehovah Jireh means the Lord my provider. And that's what I titled the lesson last week, but I never emphasized it at the end of the lesson is where the phrase comes into play. So we're going to do a quick review, and we'll make sure we emphasize that part tonight. All right? So, last week we talked, our lesson was on Hebrews 6, verses 13 to 20, which ended chapter 6. There's only 20 verses in chapter 6. And so we covered the last 8 of them last week. And would have loved to have broken it up some, but that all fit together. It would have been hard to get a thought out without including all those. Verse 13 said, when God made promise to Abraham, because he could swear by no greater, he swore by himself. That's an interesting statement. You know, sometimes we make oaths. We swear. And when we testify in court, we put our hand on a Bible and we swear to tell the truth. And what the author of Hebrews is saying, when God was communicating as he went on in this process with Abraham, he had promised him one thing up front when he was 75 in his dad's house, said, if you leave your dad, follow me, I'll raise up of you a great nation. And he kept enlarging that in promises over the next 25 years. And then after Isaac is born, he did some more promising. And here's where it says, because he could swear by nothing greater, he swore by himself. So in essence, Genesis 22, 7 to 10, and Isaac spake unto Jacob his father. This is a heart-wrenching story where Abraham is asked to sacrifice the promised child God has given him. And he said, my father. And he said, or Abraham said, here I am, my son. And he said, or Isaac, behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for a burnt offering? Verse 8 of Genesis 22, and Abraham said, my son, God will provide himself a lamb for a burnt offering. So they went both of them together, and they came to the place which God had told him of. And Abraham built an altar there, and laid the wood in order, and bound Isaac his son, and laid him upon the wood. And Abraham stretched forth his hand, and took the knife to slay his son. Again, a heart-wrenching story there. And we're going to show you something here in a moment. Well, we'll look down right now to verse 15. And so after he had patiently endured, he obtained the promise. Oh, I must have cut this one out. When Abraham, the book of Hebrews says that Abraham knew that Isaac was in chapter 11, the faith chapter, Abraham knew that Isaac was the promised child, and so his logic told him this: if God has me kill him, then God will have to raise him back to life again, because the promises haven't been fulfilled through Isaac yet. Isaac had to grow up, get married, and have a child. He had to continue the lineage of Abraham. If Isaac died and stayed dead, then the promise of God would be null and void. God would have lied to Abraham. So Abraham had this kind of faith. I don't get what he's asking me to do, but I do know this. He's going to do what he told me he'd do. So if Isaac dies, that means God's going to have to raise him up again. So that was the kind of faith that Abraham had when he looked down at his son and raised a knife, ready to thrust it in to the chest of his son. That is an incredible, incredible story. What's more incredible is what it represented, a blood covenant with Abraham. Abraham, you give me your only begotten son. Again, Abraham had an older son, Ishmael. So we say only begotten doesn't fit here, yet that's what the Bible uses. Why? Because in this covenant between God and Abraham, the only child that mattered was Isaac, because Isaac was the child of promise. Ishmael had nothing to do with the promise of God. And therefore, in this sense, he didn't count in this equation. So the only child of promise that Abraham had, Isaac, he was about to sacrifice to the Lord. And God stopped him. Again, there was no scripture for Abraham to read. Abraham, remember, Moses wrote the first 5 books of the Bible. He wrote Genesis through Deuteronomy, and none of that was around. Moses came 400 or 500 years after Abraham. So the first 5 books of the Old Testament wouldn't be written for 400 or 500 years yet. So Abraham couldn't sit down like you and I do when we get confused and hunt for a Bible verse. There wasn't any. So the only information he had was the information God gave him. And the information he had was, that's your promised child. From that child, you're going to have a nation. So his logic said that means God's got to raise him up if I kill him. If I kill him in obedience to God as a sacrifice. So God stopped him because God would have never allowed the dad to murder his son. So God stopped him, but he said, I see you have not withheld your son. He's seen that Abraham was going to go through with it. And so when the angel of the Lord came and stopped Abraham, and then there was a ram caught in the bushes, and he became the sacrificial lamb. And so the covenant was, Abraham offered his only begotten son. Centuries later, God offered his only begotten son. And so this was the blood sacrifice of how God would come into a world fallen to Satan because of the sin of Adam and Eve, and redeem multitudes of people from that world. And it all started with a covenant with Abraham. But the reason we called that lesson Jehovah Jireh is because when that ram was caught in the bush, Abraham later named that spot Jehovah Jireh, that God will provide. Now, what's amazing, Isaac said, where's the sacrifice? Abraham said, the Lord will provide. What happened? Abraham was going through with obedience. The Lord stopped him, and the Lord provided. So he named that place where that took place Jehovah Jireh. So that's why we didn't stress that at the end last week, so I wanted to be sure to stress it this way. Now let's go on to chapter 7. The first 3 verses, we're going to talk about Melchizedek. Verse 1. Now remember, going into ending chapter 5, the author of Hebrews says to his readers, I have so much I want to tell you about Melchizedek, but you're dull of hearing. And I read you when we were back on that some modern translations too stupid to pay attention. I mean, some of the modern translations put that phrase in so many different ways. Just disinterested as far as learning was concerned. And we got churches full of people in this town, Council Bluffs, Iowa, every midweek, every Sunday morning, and those that have church on Sunday night, every Sunday night. Those who meet on Saturdays, like the Seventh-day Adventists every Saturday. We have churches all over here that have a few students in them, in each of them, but the majority just come to do their service, and they don't pay attention, and they don't learn. And so the author of Hebrews is saying, I want to tell you more. Now he's getting back to that subject here in tonight's lesson, Melchizedek. Now he's going to talk about Melchizedek. For this Melchizedek, King of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him. Now, Hebrews 5, 10 and 11, right under that, called of God and high priest after the order of Melchizedek. He was talking about Jesus. Is called by God to be a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Verse 11, that's what I was referring to a moment ago, of whom we have many things to say and hard to be uttered, since you are dull of hearing. So, Hebrews 6, 19 and 20, which hope we have as an anchor of the soul, both sure and steadfast, with interest into that within the veil, whither the forerunner is for us entered, even Jesus, made a high priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So we had to, in the review, to make room for all the lesson I have tonight, I cut out verses 16, 17, 18, and 19. But 19 is down along with verse 20, right down there. So the author of Hebrews is stressing this point. Jesus is not a high priest after the order of Aaron. Remember, Aaron was Moses' brother. He became the first high priest. His son took over for him, and his son took over for him. Aaron was from the tribe of Levi. The high priest came from a specific, and all the priests, the high priest and all the priests, came from the tribe of Levi. And so if you were not a Levite, you could not be a priest of any sort, except when Israel was backslidden, and then they didn't obey the rules. They did whatever they want because they were worshiping idols, not God. So God's rules didn't apply to them because they weren't following God. But whenever they had a time of revival, read the law of Moses, or the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Bible, and aligned themselves back up with that, the high priest and all the priests had to come from the tribe of Levi, and the high priest had to be a direct descendant of Aaron, the original high priest. Jesus was of the tribe of Judah. Jesus was not qualified to be a priest in the Aaronic priesthood. I didn't say ironic. I said Aaronic. In other words, the priesthood that started with Aaron. The Aaronic priesthood could never include Jesus, because he was not a descendant. His human body was not, his humanity was not descended from the tribe of Levi, let alone Aaron, but he was of the tribe of David, the tribe of Judah. And so Jesus does not qualify under the law of Moses to be our high priest. And yet Jesus is our high priest. How come? That's what this lesson is teaching us. He's not after the order of Aaron. He's after the order of this guy named Melchizedek. Now, Melchizedek we read about in the Psalms. We read about a short bit in Genesis. Now let me catch you up to snuff here. Drop down here to the bottom of that first side, Genesis 14, verses 1 and 2, and then verses 8 to 12. Genesis 14, 1 and 2. And it came to pass in the days of Amphraphel, king of Shinar, Arioch, king of Elazar, Chedorlaomer, king of Elam, and Tidal, king of nations, that these made war with Bera, king of Sodom, and with Bersha, king of Gomorrah, Shinab, king of Admah, and Shemeber, king of Zeboam, and the king of Bela, which is Zor. Every city had a king. I tell you, I guess they hadn't formed into large countries yet. So Sodom had a king, Gomorrah had a king. And so Sodom and Gomorrah were aligned with three other cities, three other kings. So there was Sodom, Gomorrah, and the three other kings. So there was an alliance of 5 kings fighting against an invading army of 4 kings. Now the 4-king alliance has made war with the 5-king alliance. You'd think the numbers are in favor of the 5 kings. But before I go on from there, look at verse 1 again. Of the 4 kings, the invading army, the last one is Tidal, king of nations. What does that mean? Everybody else is the king of a city. Here it said king of nations. Remember, the New Testament is written in Greek. The Old Testament is written in Hebrew. Now, why was that? Hebrew was the language of the Jews. And it was Jews who wrote the Old Testament, with the exception of the book of Job. Job, we know very little about, but it was the very first book of the Bible chronologically ever written. It was written before Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy that Moses wrote. We don't know, I don't know at least, how much before, but so he was not involved in Abraham, with Abraham, and so he wasn't a Jew. But other than that, everything was, for certain, was written in Hebrew. Whoever told the story of Job was probably a Jew, and wrote it in Hebrew as well. So why was this one king in Hebrew? Remember, the New Testament written in Greek, Old Testament written in Hebrew. Why was this last of the 4 invading kings called the king of nations? If you'll see, the Hebrew word for nations there is goyim, or G-O-I-I-M. That's the Hebrew word they rendered for nations, which is very similar to the Hebrew word for just for that there, goem. I put it on one sheet. I wrote it, the Hebrew word. And the Hebrew word is something like G-O, you see, I-I-M there. That's the plural of G-O-Y-I-M. Y-I-M. That's a deep thought. Y-I-M. But anyway, so it's probably a play on words that was probably referring to the name of a city, but it was very familiar to the Hebrew word rendered nations. And so the old King James Version said king of the nations, king of nations, the modern translations all use that guy's name, Goiim, King of Goim. So that must be a city that sounds very much in Hebrew to the word nation. So he was undoubtedly a king of one city like all the other guys were. So we're having a war going on. 4 against 5. Now, what happens? Sodom and Gomorrah and their 3 allies lose. The 4 kings overthrew the 5 kings. And like they did those days, they grabbed survivors and started leading them off as probably going to be slaves when they bring them back to their homeland. That's where a lot of slaves came from in the Old Testament, was from winning wars. The survivors of the losing countries often became servants of the conquerors. And so it wasn't a color thing back then, it was a victory thing. You wanted your army to be very good. Otherwise you could be serving someone else one day if they came in and overthrew your army. So, at any rate, they grabbed a bunch of the people out of Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities, including Abraham's nephew, Lot. L-O-T. Abraham's nephew and his family are taken captive. Abraham, good old uncle, has got to do something. Abraham, let's see if I got it on this side. Flip the page over. Verse 14 of that Genesis 14 said, and when Abram, that was his name initially until God increased the promises and stretched the name Abram out to Abraham. When God first called him, he was known as Abram, and then eventually became Abraham. And so when Abram heard that his brother was taken captive, it was actually his nephew, but they used the term brother in different ways, he armed his trained servants, born in his house, 318, and pursued them on to Dan. Now I want you to get a story here. 4 kings conquered 5 kings. The armies of 4 kings conquered the armies of 5 kings. A shepherd looked at his 318 shepherds, not trained for battle, trained for watching sheep. This Abraham was a radical man of faith. Radical man of faith. Remember when God grabbed hold of this guy, he was an idol worshiper. Never heard of Jehovah God. His dad sold idols, was an idol worshiper. That's what people did. They found if they didn't have a God, they made one up and sold idols. There's no Bible telling people about Jehovah at that time. So God, figuratively speaking, tapped Abraham on the shoulder and said, hi, I'm God. And said, I want you to follow me. And if you do, here's what I'm going to do for you. So now here's this guy who would have killed his son because he figured logically God would have to raise him back up because he was the child of promise and he didn't have a son yet. We don't know how old Isaac was, but all the commentaries I read had him anywhere from 18 to 33. And I like the 133 because that seems to be how old Jesus was when he died. And that would have been a perfect match for the blood covenant. They each offered their child when they were 33. But nonetheless, so figure this man that's the promised child. He can't go away. So if God's asking me to sacrifice him, it means God's going to show off and raise him back to life again. So he was that radical in his faith. That same man said, I don't care that these 5 armies over here couldn't beat those 4. I've got 319 things in my favor. 318 servants and God Almighty. I'll take them on. And Abraham and his shepherds overcame the army of 4 with all their captives, and they had looted the city of all their precious monetary things, whether it's jewels, gold, silver, whatever it was. They'd taken it all. And Abraham caught up with them and routed them, recovered everything they took from Sodom and Gomorrah and the other cities, but paying special attention to Sodom and Gomorrah. That Sodom is where Lot lived. Sodom and Gomorrah is what God destroys later on with fire and brimstone after he rescues Lot and gets him out of the city. Poor Lot getting in trouble all the time. And God had to rescue him from this army with his uncle and a whole bunch of shepherds. I'm going to tell you something. It doesn't matter if it's a fair fight if you got God on your side. It wasn't a fair fight for the army of the 4 kings because God was on Abraham's side. But without God, it wouldn't have been a fair fight for Abraham to take shepherds and take them up against warriors. But this guy, again, was a man of radical faith. And so he rescued Lot. They recovered all the treasure from those 5 cities. And look at verse 2. Back to Hebrews 7. To whom also Abraham. So look at verse 1 again on the other side. We put in a bunch of verses from other places, but so let's flip it back over. Look at verse 1 of Hebrews 7. For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, who met Abraham returning from the slaughter of the kings and blessed him. So when Abraham's returning back with everything he recovered, there's this odd figure of the Old Testament who's called both a priest and a king. The king of Salem, which would be the king of peace. There are people, you will find preachers who are convinced that this was the pre-incarnate Christ. Pre-incarnate means Jesus appearing as a human prior to his birth. There are preachers who firmly believe that. There are some who believe that the one who appeared, the 4th man in the flaming fire when the 3 Hebrew children were cast in, was the pre-incarnate Christ. So there are those who believe that Jesus dressed himself with a human body before he was born a human, now and again in the Old Testament. Of course, anytime you believe something like that, it's a guess. I don't particularly like the guess, but there are people, it's a romanticized guess. But I don't think personally Melchizedek is a pre-incarnate Christ, and I'll tell you why. The Bible tells us he's a priest called after the order of Melchizedek. That to me says it's not Melchizedek. It's somebody else. As far as Jesus is. Jesus is different, separate from Melchizedek, because he's being called after the order of Melchizedek. If it was the pre-incarnate Christ, then he'd be a priest after the order of himself. You follow me? So I personally don't buy into that. Again, I'm not offended when people making guesses about who this was, and you'll see why they make those guesses as we go on here. So, he brought back all the folk and all the riches that were captured by the four armies. So, where does this all fit into the story of Abraham? In chapter 12 of Genesis, Abraham leaves his father's house. Chapter 13, Lot leaves with them. Their two herds were so big there wasn't enough in a lot of their travels. It was a pretty barren area, and there wasn't enough grazing for two large herds of sheep, so they decide to separate. There was a mountain area over there with better grass, and there was the desert area where they were with a shortage of grass. And Abraham, being the gentleman he is and the radical man of faith, says, Lot, you decide. Lot said, I'm going to go over there in the mountainous area where there's a lot of grass. And when he went that way, somewhere along the line, he ended up living in an evil city called Sodom, a wicked city. But Abraham must have kept touch, because he found out when those four kings took his nephew, they should have left that nephew alone when they took him captive and he went to get him. So again, chapter 14, Abraham believes God and it's counted to him for righteousness. 13, Lot leaves Abraham to go live in Sodom. Then chapter 14 comes to chapter 15. Abraham believes God and it's counted unto him for righteousness. He defeated an army. He defeated an army with an army of his own army of 318 servants. That would have been a trick. Of course, Moses did pretty good with one serpent. 318 servants whom he had trained to be shepherds. God was with them. Abraham meets Melchizedek. Now, verse 2, to whom also Abraham gave a tenth part of all, first being by interpretation king of righteousness, and after that also king of Salem, which is king of peace. So note, Abraham pays the tithe of all the spoils that he recovered. He pays 10% of that to Melchizedek. So Abraham pays tithes. Remember, tithes and offerings. The word tithes means a tenth. There's a difference between a tithe and an offering. An offering is any gift you give to God. A tithe is giving God 10% of what you earn. So if you earn $1,000, you give God $100. And offering could be $1.50. But tithe, Abraham tithes to Melchizedek, gave 10% of everything he recovered. So, let's read underneath verse 2 there. Genesis 14, beginning with verse 21. The king of Sodom said unto Abraham, give me the persons, in other words, all my citizens that you've recovered, and you take the goods to yourself. And Abraham said, in other words, he said, Abraham, you keep all the wealth you recovered. I just want my citizens. All right? Abraham's response in verse 22. And Abraham said to the king of Sodom, I have lifted up my hand unto the Lord, the Most High God, the possessor of heaven and earth, that I will not take from a thread even to a shoe latchet, and that I will not take anything that is thine, lest thou shouldest say, I have made Abraham rich. He knew who was blessing him, and it wasn't the king of Sodom. God was blessing him. And he did not want any room for the news to go out. The king of Sodom had made him rich. So he said, thanks, I don't want any of your money. Except, he kept 10% to pay tithe. And those 318 servants, he gave it stipends of what he recovered to them as payment for their helping him win that war. Abraham himself kept nothing, and all the other money he gave back to the the 5 kings rather. So he didn't keep any of it for himself. And in verse 24, save only that which the young men have eaten, and the portion of the men which went with me, Ashner, Eskiel, and Mamre, let them take their portion. So he's saying, we're going to give some of this, what we've recovered, to these brave men that helped me. All right, now, the 5 kings lost to the 4 kings through the king of Sodom. The 4-king coalition through the king of Sodom offered to allow Abraham to keep all the spoil. Oh, okay, the 5 kings through the 1 king from Sodom offered Abraham to keep everything that he recovered. Abraham didn't keep the spoil. He didn't want the king of Sodom to be able to say that he made him rich, etc., etc. Now, Genesis 14:18-20. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. At a time when Israel did not exist, Abraham was the father of Israel. It was a long time before Abraham had Isaac was born at this time. Had Isaac, and then Isaac had Jacob and Esau, and then Jacob had the 12 sons who kept having children and grandchildren, and the 12 sons became, their names became the names of the 12 tribes of Israel. All right, now there's actually turned into 13 tribes. Joseph, there is no, one of the most famous sons involved in the children of Jacob is Joseph. One of the most beautiful stories in the book of Genesis. There is no tribe of Joseph. That's not a curse on him, that's a blessing. Because when Isaac was prophetically blessing his children before he died, he didn't bless Joseph. He blessed Joseph's 2 sons, Ephraim and Manasseh. So Joseph becomes 2 tribes for his faithfulness to God. So instead of a tribe of Joseph, there's a tribe of Ephraim and a tribe of Manasseh, his sons. So he is doubly blessed. But now that makes 13 tribes. We always talk about the 12 tribes of Israel. God took a 10th. Wasn't really a 10th. It turned out to be a 13th. But God took one of the tribes for himself and called it a tithe. God took the tribe of Levi and said, they're mine. So when they finally possessed the promised land, and he divided all the promised land into 12 states, so to speak, and gave each one of the tribe of the 12 tribes, the 13 tribes minus Levi. Getting confused here. When he took those 12 tribes, he gave each of them an area in the promised land, 2.5 of them on the other side of Jordan. So they ended up with a little more land than originally intended. 2.5 stayed over there, and 1.5 of that came over here, and so 9.5 were on this side of Jordan. And so that's 12 tribes inheriting 12 areas. The Levites inherited nothing as far as land, what we would call a state. They inherited cities in every one of those states, those divisions of land, so that the priest would be close to all the children of Israel. You following me? That's what God did with them. All right, so this high priest now, let me read again what I read a moment ago, Genesis 14:18-20. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abraham of the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. Isn't that something? We don't think these guys ever meant before. Abraham knew this was somebody special. I'm going to give 10% to him. This guy knew that Abraham was something special. He was the covenant man of God. And so he said about Abraham, said that he was the, blessed be Abraham, the Most High God, possessor of heaven and earth. And then verse 20, and blessed be the Most High God who has delivered thine enemies into thy hand. Abraham is saying this, and he gave him tithes of all. We don't know how the wording is there. That could have been Melchizedek who said that last part, but where it says he gave tithes, that was Abraham giving tithes to Melchizedek. Now here's what it says about Melchizedek, why some people come away with the conclusion that it was the pre-incarnate Christ. Verse 3 says this about Melchizedek. He was without father, without mother, without descent, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but made like unto the Son of God, abideth a priest continually. That sounds like God, doesn't it? But is that what it's really, is it really saying what you think it's saying when you read it? Most good commentaries do not believe that it meant that Melchizedek didn't have a mom or dad. They don't believe that's what it means at all. They don't believe that it means he didn't get born one day. He had no beginning. They don't believe that he had no end means that he never died. That's not what they believe is meant here. What they believe is meant here is there was nowhere in any record books, anybody writing anything. There is nowhere to find the birth of Melchizedek, who his parents were, how old he was when he met Abraham, when he died. There was no recording. Because he became a type of Christ, God hid all the records of him. So that as far as looking at the records, he wasn't born, he just was. You couldn't prove his birth, you couldn't prove his death. Not recorded anywhere at any time. Now why would God do such a thing? Because the Son of God that was going to be born in a town called Bethlehem, even he had a time he was born. Born in Bethlehem. Even he had a time when he died. But the reason God appears to be doing this, hiding all records of Melchizedek, is to bring out the fact that Jesus died, but he rose again. And Jesus lived in heaven before he was born. They wanted to bring out this idea that he's a type of Christ and that he's eternal in the sense of our knowing him. Now again, I tend to agree with the commentators on this. I don't believe that Melchizedek was the pre-incarnate Christ. I will not argue with someone who does believe that because I understand why they believe it. So when you read all that, I can understand that, why they believe it. But I tend to agree with the commentaries who look at everything and say, okay, what's really being said here? So if you take the words at face value, he had no beginning, no ending, then you'd say he's God. But we never read of him again until the book of Psalms. When the book of Psalms talks about somebody is going to be a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. That's where the author of Hebrews gets all this information. Jesus is not a priest after the order of Aaron. He's a priest after the order of Melchizedek. Now, why do I stress this? Why is it so important? Now, listen very carefully. If Jesus was a priest after the order of Aaron, he would be a lawbreaker. The law forbid anyone who wasn't a Levite from being a priest, and anyone who wasn't a direct descendant of Aaron being a high priest. So, if you merge the law, all those who want to merge the law with Christianity, like all the false teachers that Paul kept warning his folk about in all of his epistles, they said, okay, you're saved by faith, but now you got to get into the law to stay saved. You can't merge law and Jesus. The minute you make them one, you condemn Jesus as a law breaker. Jesus has nothing to do with the law of Moses. We'll get into that as we get a little farther into Romans 7. And it's such an important truth to understand. You can't have the law and Christianity merged. Because if you do, you make Jesus an outlaw. And if Jesus is an outlaw, then he deserves to die of stoning under the law of Moses. You can't merge these things. They're different covenants, and when you merge them, you make Jesus guilty of breaking the very law that he had to keep perfectly in order to become worthy to be our sacrifice, the sacrifice for our sins. You do away with all that if you try to make the law of Moses part of the New Testament doctrine. You can't have both. Again, I said this not long ago. You remember the old song, love and married, go together like a baby carry. What?
A horse and carriage.
What was that?
Horse and carriage.
Oh, horse and carriage.
Yeah.
You can't have one without the other. I say, law and Jesus, law and Jesus. You can't have one and the other. You can't have them. They don't go together like love and marriage or a horse and carriage. They don't go together at all. Each does away with the other. If I have to keep the law, then Jesus accomplished nothing for me. Paul wrote, if the law makes me righteous, then Christ died in vain. If I could get right with God any other way than faith in him, then he died in vain. He didn't have to die. He could have insisted I did it the other way. But the bottom line was there was no other way. Once I sinned once, there was no other way for me to get right except Jesus. And I do away with all that when I bring the law back into play. All right? So in closing, down at the very bottom, this is the psalm where it talks about Melchizedek. The Lord said unto my Lord. In other words, God said on, the Father says unto Jesus, sit thou at my right hand until I make thine enemies thy footstool. The Lord shall send the rod of thy strength out of Zion. Rule thou in the midst of thine enemies. The people shall be willing in the day of thy power, in the beauties of holiness from the womb of the morning. Thou hast the dew of thy youth. You say, huh? Well, this is verse 4 that we're interested in. The Lord has sworn and will not repent. And that word simply means he won't change his mind. Repentance is a change of mind. The Lord has sworn and will not repent. Thou art a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. So that's what the lesson is about. And we're going to see in the next week or two, I forget exactly where it is in chapter 7. In the next week or two, we're going to see why that's so important that you understand he's a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. Because that truth causes something else, something enormous. Something else that is enormous in importance to take place. Because of the one, the other had to happen. And we'll get into that.